Hey there, YouTubers. I just earlier today made my 20-minute soliloquy, I call it. Friends, Romans, Countrymen. That's not the title, but I do say that towards the beginning. That's a reference to Shakespeare, is it not? And I call it breadcrumbs, and then cleverly I've got pictures of donuts here, which are kind of bread-like objects. Voodoo donuts. So that's where I am in my timeline. What I want to talk about today or next, it won't take too long now. I want to give a flavor of what Synergetics is like because I was mentioning in this last video how it is written in prose and therefore it is not designed to be as opaque as sometimes a more squiggly sort of Springer Verlag classic might look. It's a different style of writing. It's in the humanities, and I wanted to give that sense. But I want to set it up first with two other observations. First of all, I was at OSCON Open Source Conference convention recently, and I got my free book here. Very pleased to get it. I'm very interested in GraphQL because I'm interested in graph databases in general. And while I was eating donuts, actually, not voodoo donuts, at OSCON, I was thumbing through this, having just picked it up. And it starts out with graph theory, which I highly encourage you to start studying early and link it up to polyhedrons because polyhedrons, being wireframes, are themselves what we call graphs. In other words, they have nodes and they have edges. And that's the vocabulary you want to pick up. A node is just a corner, and an edge is a link between two corners. And then you have openings, and there's topological relationships between how many openings versus nodes versus edges. Euler's law for polyhedrons is where to start there. Another thing I want to set you up with is an actual tensegrity by Kenneth Nelson himself, the Grand Master of tensegrity sculptures. Most of his are really huge, like in Baltimore. Check it out. And I want to say what you could think of when you look at something like this. Think of these tension wires that connect these rods just kind of float, right? They're like floating compression rods. Think of going to a website and just scrolling down, you know how you can just keep scrolling and or like you're on your phone with your thumbs and you're scrolling down and down and down until you decide to jump or hyperlink to some other web page, and then you scroll through that for a while, scroll, 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 and then you get to where you click and you jump to another website and so on. So the actual scrolling experience where you're actually reading, a reading program we'll call it, are the compression rods, and the tension members that hold it all together, these are your hyperlinks, you could say. And the hyperlinks are kind of invisible, right? I mean, you've just got this protocol, HTTP, that just jumps you, takes you to another server, another host, and serves you another page. But if you're studying something like a topic like electrical engineering or whatever, as you gradually visit more and more sites and hop around, you kind of get the big picture, right? It starts to hold together in your mind. You start to develop a sense of the whole, and that would be sort of the tensegrity as a whole, as it holds together. You could even think of a tensegrity sphere. So both of those little intro anecdotes have to do with graph theory, edges, connections, and so on, and that's the space to be in. Now, when I read this, you're going to think, well, who is this for? And I want you to think about how when Fuller was a young man, and at one point he'd flunked out of Harvard, and his family, kind of as punishment to sober him up a bit, he was, it's a story about how he got expelled. It has to do with his being a showman at heart and really wanting to be um, kind of in a theatrical atmosphere. So he went to a theater and stood outside with a dog. So when the cast came out from the theater, they're all like, "Oh, look at this cute dog." And he took them all out to the bar or something and bought them all drinks. He was being expansive and extravagant, and he blew his entire budget. and had to be expelled for bad behavior, you could say. So they sent him, I think, to a cotton mill somewhere to do work. But what he remarks on from that time is how small the vocabulary of the people around him was, and then how over time, as he grew through the end of the 1800s all the way till 1983, his experience was of people becoming more and more literate, more and more endowed in terms of the vocabulary that they just took for granted. Also, he noticed how radio and later television had the effect of standardizing more and more how people spoke, what their accent, what their cadence was, and all that. So I would say Synergetics is a workout in terms of pushing you to yet a larger vocabulary, but it could be for younger kids. It doesn't have to be that this is like a professor or something reading this. Don't think when you read this you have to be old. Think of it as continuing to improve your comfort level around technical writing. And in fact, what this is about is, I would say, technical reading. In other words, he's going to talk to us about what it's like to get overwhelmed and not be able to make sense out of stuff, and then to sort of dismiss the world as, well, it doesn't make any sense then because I can't currently make sense out of it. There's just too much going on. It's too crazy making. And then instead of continuing to hang in there, you kind of panic and then you replace what you don't understand with some fantasy that at least I can hold on to this fantasy, right? So replace reality with fantasy. And then he comforts us at the end, saying, actually, if you hang in there and keep studying the universe as it is, then you're going to come to more and more appreciate how it's actually quite coherent over time. So let me just read a little bit, and I'll stop and comment here and there. So he starts out, spherical reference. Operationally speaking, the word omnidirectional involves a speaker who is observing from some viewing point. He says, people and things are going every which way about me, around me. It seems chaotic to him at first, but on further consideration, he finds the opposite to be true, that only inherent order is being manifest. First, we observe that we do not and cannot live and experience in either a one-dimensional linear world nor in a two-dimensional, infinitely extended planar world. So if you think back to Edwin Abbott's Flatland and how he introduces what it would be like to live in only two or one dimension, can we really do that? Can we really realistically experience anything less than being in space? And to him, there's only a priori what we would call space. That's the beginning point. It's not that we build up to that. You may, in your space, as a viewer, see a line or see a plane like a piece of paper, but that doesn't reduce your experience to either one or two dimensions. And this is partly why he starts with the tetrahedron as the most primitive thing. Even though there are lines there that make the tetrahedron, as you zoom in on them, you'll find that they have thickness. As you zoom in on the corners, you'll find that they resolve. And so the only direction as you zoom in is that's the direction of infinity. If there's infinity, it's in zooming in more and more, continuing to subdivide. So omnidirectional means that a center of a movable sphere of observation has been established a priori by universe for each individual life's inescapably mobile viewpoint. Like shadows, these move everywhere silently with people. These physical existence, environment, surrounds of life events spontaneously resolve into two classes. One, those events that are to pass tangentially by the observer, and two, those event entities other than self that are moving radially either toward or away from the observer. So there's like traffic going around you, there's ships passing in the night, there's stuff that's not coming directly towards you or going directly away from you, and that's what we're calling tangential to you. And it may come by at a closest point, which we'll talk about in a second, but he's just starting to organize your experience for you in terms of radial and tangential, and you're in a sort of a private bubble. You can't see it, no one else can see it, but there is kind of a sphere that you're in. It's kind of similar to what Wittgenstein called the visual room. It's your sensory bubble, and you're actually aware of more than just what's in front of you. You're aware of being in sort of your sensorium, we could call it. The tangentially passing energy events are always and only moving in lines that are at nearest moment perpendicular to the radii of the observer, which means that the multiplicity of his real events does not produce chaos. It produces discretely apprehendable experience increments, all of which can be chartingly identified by angle and frequency data, therewith to permit predictable reinterpositioning events and environmental transformations. So most people, when they read stuff like this, they make fun of Bucky. They say, this is ridiculous. He's using too many syllables. He's being too verbose. They don't get that this is his sort of poetry. This is his way of trying to boost your vocabulary and give you a comfort level with this kind of writing that is actually a workout and is actually going to make sense if you stick with it. The observer's unfamiliarity with the phenomena he is observing, the multiplicity of items of interaction and their velocity of transformations and their omni-engulfing occurrences tend to dismay the observer's hope of immediate or reasonable comprehension. Therefore, observers are often induced to discontinue their attempts at technical comprehension of their experience in a surrender of the drive to comprehend. This fills the potential comprehension void of the observer with a sense of chaos, which sensation he then subconsciously converts into a false rationale by explaining to himself that the environment is inherently chaotic, ergo, inherently incomprehensible. Thus, he satisfies himself that he is being super reasonably realistic and that universe is just annoyingly disorderly, ergo, frequently dismissible, which seemingly warrants his invention of whatever kind of make-believe universe seems momentarily most satisfying to him. So, like, once you give up on understanding your environment because it seems too chaotic, then you have a rationale for just living in your head and making up whatever belief system to fill the void, right? Fill it with your own fantasies. Give up on what's actually being presented to you. The more humanity probes and verifies experimentally by reducing its theories to demonstrable practice in order to learn whether or not the theories are valid, the more clearly does the universe reveal itself as being generated and regenerated only upon a complex of entirely orderly relationships. The inherent spherical center viewpoint with which each individual is endowed generates its own orderly radii of observation in a closed finite system of event observations that are subject to orderly angular subdividing, recording, and interrelating in spherical trigonometric computational relationship to the observer's inherently orderly sphere of reference. So he's taking that invisible bubble that he's postulated as surrounding each one of us. I'm thinking of Peter Sloterdijk and his book, Bubbles, Foams. I'm thinking about spherical experience. He's getting you to think of yourself in a sphere and then thinking of how that sphere, adding great circles, adding angles, and a kind of a grid to that sphere, you give it order. And that's the natural order of things, that they have this sort of spherical geometry. And then he's going to compare that, and this is the last paragraph I'm going to read, with the more awkward sort of forcing of everything to conform to rectilinear, which he thinks is a great source of awkwardness in our thinking. The expression frame of reference is not only, quote, square as imputed by the two-dimensional language of youth, but also by its exclusive three-dimensional axes of reference. Such XYZ coordinates impose inept, exclusively rectilinear definings which are uncharacteristic of the omni-wavilinear orbiting universe reality. Science has not found any continuous surfaces, solids, straight lines, or infinitely extensible non-closed system planes. The only infinity humanity has discovered experimentally is that of the whole fraction subdivisibility of wholes into parts, as for instance by the progressive halvings that divide the finitely closed circle into ever smaller central angle expressed arc increments. The spherical dimensions of tangent and angle frequencied intervals can always be searchlighted right on all actual event tracery. So if you think of this as trying to inspire a young person's imagination by linking prose writing with very sharp mental imagery, this could all be accompanied by a cartoon which has a lot of high resolution images, right? This is an attempt, you could say, to link left and right brain if you don't mind thinking in those terms. It's a way to verbalize things that usually only get expressed in our culture in a more mathematically cryptic language. Like, this is all very understandable once you've got the mental pictures and once you're sitting down to do spherical trigonometry, then all of this kind of makes sense, but you're not thinking anymore in prose. You're not thinking in ordinary language, you could call it. But it's really extraordinary language. I'm going to read one more paragraph. Because spherical trigonometry sounded so formidable, it was omitted from primary education. Humans preferred to rationalize their observed experience exclusively in terms of non-existent straight lines and planes, and thus they evolved illogical, linear, and square models of universe, such as the four corners of the wide, wide world with its non-existent fixed up and down coordinates. Employment of the square XYZ coordinate frame of mensurial reference in all present scientific exploration is similar to going to Washington from Boston only via Chicago, because that pattern conformed to the scientist's only right-angled expressibility of relationships. Of course, if you know calculus, you could evolve a curve plotted on the XYZ gridding, which may shorten your course, but if you don't know calculus, you have to go via Chicago. So basically, he's saying that we misinform ourselves by avoiding thinking more spherically, more holistically, and what he's trying to do in synergetics is limber up our thinking so that we can develop greater fluency with, I would say, technical writing in general. So this is, again, this is kind of a workout to read this kind of stuff, but what other opportunities do you get to read this kind of stuff? Mostly you're not going to be presented in your schooling with lengthy passages that have sharp geometric content that are nevertheless written out in prose. And to say, well, Bucky is just too verbose, this is just crazy talk, that's overly dismissive, and it's actually doing what he says we do. When we're confronted with too much information at once, we think of it as chaos, disconnect, and go off and make up a fantasy. And here he's just trying to structure our experience with his, you could say, invented language, but you'll notice there weren't that many neologisms in here. Things like chartingly, he often turns something into an adverb, but other than that, I would say there's not all that much that he's inventing in terms of new words. He's often criticized for too many neologisms, and people, they will complain that this kind of writing makes no sense, so that synergetics is just all nonsense, and dismiss it. And this, ironically, is about that process. When too much is going on and you can't figure it out, you tend to make up a fantasy like Bucky's a crackpot or something like that, or the universe is a crackpot, or that the universe makes no sense. So that's the kind of writing that you'll get. And notice as I keep scrolling, there's no mathematical squiggling going on. It's still very technical, but it's not designed to force you into calculus, right? Of the normal kind. That doesn't mean you shouldn't learn calculus. It doesn't mean that you should avoid normal, classic, conventional mathematics. It's not saying that you should drop everything and only read synergetics. All of that would be flawed and fallacious. But nevertheless, here's your American heritage, your literature by someone who is not, in my opinion, really that pathological compared to what I read about him in the press sometimes. And I think that's just because a lot of people feel threatened by inconvenient truths more than by an experiment in pedagogy or andragogy, which is what I see going on here. A bold experiment. And Applewhite writes in Cosmic Fishing, it was not that easy to get this all published because once people started reading it, they're like, what? But looking ahead, anticipating, coming forward now 40 years after it's written, I'm thinking, we're all submerged in big data, machine learning. You go out on Twitter, you go out anywhere, and you're just deluged with technical readings and writings. And the temptation to tune out and panic and think this is just crazy is now way beyond just what Synergetics is offering. It's like all the technical disciplines, they all have their own sort of silo talk. And here we have an attempt to be comprehensive and link together many disciplines like graph theory and geometry, architecture, tensegrity. Give it a shot sometime. Check it out. Worth reading. Talk to you later.